Hello, ARC 302 students. Today I'll be walking you through some ideas related to making your models at half-inch scale and some of the things we're going to want to know before moving forward in that process. I like this quote. I forget where it comes from, that sometimes you make things, then you have an idea. Sometimes you have an idea, then you make things. It works both ways. So this idea that through making and through iterating in design, we can learn about the processes behind design and the kind of ideas behind it. These are some paper airplanes that I made as models. They're actually functional models. They're white wings airplanes. And I like just assembling things. I think that's a fascination that many architects have. This is an early model I made when I was in middle school. And so we're going to dive into what is a model. We're going to give some examples, talk about materials, sketching your first ideas and iterating on those, the dimensionality of materials, detailed thinking about how materials come together, making a jig in order to build a kind of truss or repeated truss work, and then talk about assembly and craft. So etymologically, excuse me, the word model spans many definitions. These are a few of them. But models are examples of things that help us understand scale in the world. So there's this question, is there a good way to make a good model? What is especially important in models? And the answer, I don't think there's a special recipe to make a good model. Precision is important. The model needs to be exact in scale. A model should be detailed enough to be photographed and eventually use the pictures for montages and presentations. So you can think of the model that you're making as content for other things that you can create, such as renderings, photographs, diagrams, things like that as well. Tools of the trade, we'll go into those in more detail. This is an example from our design library of some models, and I'll breeze through a whole bunch of examples of different styles of or methods of making models in terms of materiality, some more lightweight in terms of paper or chipboard, some made of wood, or different materialities we can investigate. Sometimes just layered sketch models are really quick ways to study something. Sometimes you have a more detailed idea. This model would probably be impossible without the help of a computer. Many models are kind of leaning that way these days, but I think the process by which models are made by hand is still incredibly relevant and important to develop a sense of materiality. And many of the examples lean towards that. You'll see examples where different materials are used to represent different elements in the architecture, for example. Some models that investigate nested or repeated patterns are always interesting, especially in our kind of sense of thinking of a biogenic architecture or biogenic design to our architecture. Models have to be stored; they are physical things, which makes them somewhat inherently interesting. And the idea that they express a kind of finality to something, they express the stage of development in a design. Some early models that I made in my undergraduate studies here at ASU. Interested in light. Here's a drawing I made to make the model. So sometimes you make a set of instructions for yourself that describe how you might make something. So here I'm working out some math and fractions and dimensions and how I want these different spacing of elements to appear. Sometimes translucency or materiality plays well into a design. You can think about how light will reflect through materiality or different materials you could use. I think in this case there was vellum or mylar, some kind of translucent material used. How the building meets the ground is also important. I think the notion that our models are just objects, is works against us. We want to integrate into the landscape as much as possible at times. And sometimes that means building a model of a checkerboard pattern where you can sink your model down into this kind of earthen fabric. This is an example of a library project I think I did in my third year, actually, which is ironic a little bit. Um, And then models, can express all kinds of different things. You could use little things you find on your desk from a package that you received to make a little model. You can model with anything. This is just cardboard, chipboard, some paint, some basswood, things coming together to make different models at different scales. This was a housing project for New Orleans, investigating units, or a digital model where you're kind of figuring something out, right? Models can be exploratory. This one is just made of paper. Some paper models are a fast way to work out ideas. And the notion that we model kind of things abstractly at first is fine, and we work towards another level of detail is always useful in model making. So these are examples from across the years I've been teaching of student and other models, sometimes digital, sometimes physical, sometimes working back and forth between the two in order to arrive to a solution. But the essence of model making being that you're exploring the scalar nature and material nature of what you're working with. Some models here at an urban scale. This was for a housing project in California. This model actually folded to be, inside of a suitcase, which was kind of unique. And, that's a few examples of models we could start to think about, but ultimately it's going to be up to you guys to frame and discuss and discover how your model takes form and the process by which you use to get there. Okay, we're going to cover and discuss some tools for model making. And here we have some of the basics. So might need some kind of triangle. I like a metal triangle. If you're tracing or drawing, it's nice to have a plastic triangle because you can actually see through it. I have some trace paper. I have some dimensional lumber, including some small dowels. I think they're 1/8 of an inch. And then some other small dimensional basswood. Um, Basswood is more stable and stronger than balsa wood, so I'd recommend sticking with basswood if you're using wood. I have a metal ruler that has a cork back, which is important so it doesn't kind of slip around on you when you're cutting material. I have some tacky glue, this is my kind of go-to glue. It dries quickly and you don't need much of it to connect material together. An Olfa blade or X-Acto knife will work. I use both. The Olfa blade is nice because you can quickly swap out the blades as needed. I don't know if you can see the perforations there, but the blade is easy to refresh. Be very careful because they're very sharp. Some kind of pencil, something to mark with, and scissors in case I'd like to cut some cardstock paper or other material. So that's kind of the basics of things you might need. Along with, I'm going to start with some Stonehenge paper here. So this is warm white, has nice weight to it, and it's easy to glue, relatively easy to cut, and is kind of like a thicker type paper, this Stonehenge paper. There's also different brands you can buy that are similar. This one's a little beat up, but I'm going to cut off that corner so it doesn't matter. And so we'll get started here with a few different tips and tricks for cutting material, and just so you're safe while you're making your models. So for this next portion of the video, I'm going to focus on a couple things about safety, to do with the safety factor with these X-Acto blades. They are very sharp, so please be incredibly careful. You don't want to cut yourself, so one of the things to avoid doing is cutting towards your body. If I'm cutting down this way, for example, I'd want to sit to the left, have my body over here and be cutting along so that the blade can't accidentally slip and cut me accidentally. The idea that we're pressing lightly with the blade is very important, so I'm going to demonstrate a kind of cut. I'm using a metal ruler with a cork back so that it won't slip. And with my pre-cut piece here, I'm just going to cut, let's say like a 4-inch piece here. So at 15 inches should give me 4 inches. Using my cutting mat on the background, which is important to have a nice cutting mat. I'm going to lightly score this material for the first pass. I'm going to hold the ruler so that my fingers are not too close to the edge of the ruler, but where I can put firm pressure down on the ruler. And using the blade, with this Olfa blade, I have the retractable blade. Don't have it way out in space where it can wobble around on you. You want to have it only a couple clicks out so that the blade can't move. With regular X-Acto blades, that's not so much of an issue, but you don't want to have the blade all the way extended, is what I'm saying. It also increases the risk that you could cut yourself. So with my ruler lined up here on the 15-inch mark, I'm going to do a couple light scores. The first one is just to align where the blade is in the paper, so I'm not even really pressing down that hard at all. And already the blade is through the first layer of paper. And it should be with 3 kind of passes there. I can cut through that material with ease. So the edge is much cleaner when you do that. I don't know how well you can see this edge, but it comes out much cleaner when you cut slowly and methodically and use multiple passes on your cuts. So that's one important thing to keep in mind as you're cutting out material. You can be tracing on the material your design in order to cut it out, or even printing and overlaying things, trace paper or prints or whatever you'd like to do. You can spray mount a drawing to foam core or to chipboard, for example, and cut out pieces if you'd like. You don't always need a laser cutter, for example. And that's kind of some of the basics of safety. Now, when you're not using your blade, always retract the blade when it's in the position on your desk or somewhere. Never just leave it open. It's very dangerous because these things are scalpel level sharp. So be very, very careful. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do in my preparation is to sketch a quick idea of something that I might want to build. This is going to be a study model. So I'm going to say probably working with a pencil is the way to go. You can use whichever drawing instruments make you feel the most comfortable. And I'm thinking I'm going to create something, drawing just kind of a quick massing idea here that kind of has a central kind of earthen wall to it. And I might think about the dimensionality of it and begin to think about openings in that wall and things like that. But at first I want to sketch it in relationship to a couple other elements. And so I'm imagining that I have a kind of folded roof that comes over this element here to some distance over there. Maybe I didn't draw that perfectly at first. That's okay. This is just a sketch. And my roof is going to be supported by a series of kind of columns, 3 or 4 columns in the back there. And I'm also going to have a kind of mass or a wall intersecting this volume. Okay. So now I could maybe make some window mullions in here if there was some kind of glazing for parts of this. Or maybe I discover that, based on how this particular climate is behaving, that some of this is some other type of pattern. I'm going to use a vertical delineation for this. Maybe it's some kind of screen or something that lets breeze through. Just kind of sketching a quick concept here. Now this is a small node of a shelter I'm imagining that I'm going to create here. So I would need to consider a few things. First of all, maybe the connection of this sloped roof to the wall here would be important to consider. I might want to think about, is that held up by a small clerestory window, or is this wall kind of tapered to meet and pick up that wall, that roof as a kind of mass or a thin volume? So those are all things I can work out through modeling it. So I'm going to show you a few techniques to begin. First of all, modeling perhaps the kind of ridge of a roof form like this, and think about how we might start to model the rest. Also thinking about, do we stack material for this kind of earthen wall, and that becomes some kind of expression that way. So I'm beginning to have kind of maybe I'll get this kind of a bold outline, the kind of beginnings of an idea here related to my small shelter. So this could be one node of a learning center. We're just going to think of it as an individual building right now, not necessarily thinking about the site beyond building maybe a small type base initially for said site. Now that I've iterated on one idea, I think the goal is going to be to evolve that idea to be something a little bit closer to what I'd like to model. So I'm going to throw a layer of trace over this drawing and add a couple little features to some of the details that I didn't consider before, namely that I'd like the design to respond to an elevated edge of the site. So I'm going to just sketch over my original sketch and kind of say that that is a taller aspect of something that might step down, for example, and this could comprise the base of a model. And maybe I don't have the dimensions perfectly in mind yet. I can kind of start to draft those. But then maybe something where the building is responding to a change in level in terms of topography would be interesting. And we can start to imagine if there's some kind of wall that then begins to somewhat kind of intersect that, what the geometry might start to do, and does that thickness of that wall serve some kind of purpose eventually. Beginning to think about a roof that has a couple series of spanning points. So I'm spanning on a series of points, maybe across this wall, that based on where my roof could potentially be bearing or loading onto that. So each of these would be a kind of connection point to some kind of roof. And then perhaps out here I have a series of columns, and we could imagine a kind of butterfly type roof that floats over the design, over the land. And so if my butterfly roof has this kind of ridge down the middle and is bearing at these known points, for example, then I know that I'm going to need a couple things. I'm going to need, um, based on this elevation change, a base or a mass of the earth that represents that level change. So I'll want to build something that's like that. I also know I'm going to build some kind of modules or something to represent, or strips of material to represent this. Maybe this is kind of a rammed earth or earthen wall of some type. My butterfly roof, if I wanted to break out a little bit of a thicker profile line just to show the difference in that form, so we could show kind of the profile of what one would see by changing line weights, for example, during a sketch. And if the notion of this roof is that it could help collect water, for example, or to have some other function that I'm beginning to conceive of, are there flows of air or water or moisture or local topography that feed into this design that make it more successful? And how might I represent some of those various materials or elements of the design? Again, it's very free and open to your interpretation in some ways. So I'd say the most important thing is that your model is well crafted, that you're sketching with a degree of kind of looseness and fastness, but also accuracy that allows you to kind of work through an idea or notion of an idea, and that you're also exploring and kind of changing things as you go in the design. There's more paper in the world than we could ever sketch on. um, so I'm going to pull another piece of trace on here and imagine, just with a real loose sketch, what the kind of reaction of creating an interior might be with this, maybe with my lighter pen, choosing to draw on myself. And, I think the kind of mode that could work here is some kind of connection with the roof, forming a kind of enclosure. So something that happens along here, and maybe part of the site is actually carved in to allow there to be this kind of connection with the the mass of the ground form, for example, creating a kind of interior space in here. And so if my interior walls are going to stop short potentially and do something like this, or if there's maybe an outdoor balcony type space that's shaded or covered over here, I'm starting to think about what the quality of that space could be, and my facade kind of running further down there potentially, and having some kind of like little kind of open garden space in here where someone stands and has a coffee. And the space starts to be unfolded and drawn by what you choose to kind of draw and represent. And I can think of this in a way that it's buildable. I don't have to think of it as purely shapes or purely geometries. They're spaces, and spaces can overlap. They can do things that objects can't. They can form paths through. They can do, the notion of constructing a kind of spatial logic for yourself, or framing that for yourself, could be important or interesting. So I know I'm going to need a few things, like for this butterfly structure, I'm going to need some kind of connection here for my vertical elements that has to do with the structure. I know I'm at least going to have structure at those bearing points, right? For example, maybe part of the roof tapers back here, as I'm kind of implying there. But there's also going to be other members potentially and other beams, such that the spacing of this roof works out and makes sense. So I could begin to think about creating a jig. For example, a jig is something that would help me glue wood members together at this exact angle, right? Repeatedly. So the jig would look something like this as a solid piece, and I'll show this a bit later in this process, and that would allow me a place to lay in and glue, wood members that then, once they're dry, I could take it out of this kind of mold and repeat the process and lay in wood in there again and glue it, and have a series of, for lack of a better term, kind of glue lamb beams, or maybe even trusses. You could build something like this to invent a truss. Imagine inverting it, and I create kind of a truss shape of some kind. Then I could build my truss members in here if I know the spanning points and the load points. Let's say there's a wall that was loaded there and there. So my truss does, I don't know what the truss does. Maybe it's something like this, where it's partly in tension, you know. So if it's spanning from two simple points, then there's something in the middle that has to resist that moment or twisting force. To get not too far into structures, but back into the kind of design of things, let's throw another layer on this and imagine that we have a kind of um, approach to its sectional quality. So maybe I can use this to sketch a kind of section as well, which would be interesting. And potentially my section model could break off here and form a section through this element here with the wall above, right? Some kind of open floor area before meeting the lighter line weight of that glass partition. Maybe I start to represent in here where that roof brings in its section, right? And sketch that in probably a heavier line weight as well. And balancing kind of speed and accuracy here, right? So there's my kind of glazing wall. I know I'm gonna need some kind of columns in here eventually that help me support this. And in the section, I can start to draw those things in terms of, well, okay, there's a slab, right? And this wall is going to have its probably foundations and things like that, but we can get more into detail on that later. And then I built this as two models, in fact, and that can, kind of split open in a way would be really interesting. So again, lots of different ways we can start to work through the qualities of the model and start to think about how it comes together in the end. Now, the other section of this model will be really interesting too, because you're looking back this direction at that other half of the massing. So I'm really just drawing a kind of slice through here. That's what a section really is. And we can, for further clarity, kind of poche what might be earthen or concrete in this version. And have a sense of that these things carry beyond with some columns and some notion of an outdoor floor. Now there's the beginning of the kind of interior space that could be studied. For a variety of uses, we could start to investigate, elements of furniture and what the human scale kind of really feels like in these spaces. Is that glazing too tall or too short? I don't know. I'd have to kind of get an interior perspective potentially to kind of see that, but it starts to give you a sense of, um, the space itself and its kind of unfolding nature. So the way to iterate through this is to, continue to change your view, continue to add layers and sketch over. If we go back a few layers, you'll find, the different ways we were thinking about structure again, different ways of thinking about changing the massing of the ground. And that all just came from this quick first initial sketch that I had maybe an idea for a roof that kind of hovers over a wall. So be exploring and have a lot of fun. So beginning out to kind of make a quick study model, a paper model, I'm marking out a sheet of paper with some measured points that I'm going to use as a kind of grid to help me unfold a structure with this paper. And so the first thing I'll be doing is kind of marking that grid, the spacing individually, just marking 2 points in a line for each point using my background cutting mat as a kind of guide. I'll place some trace paper over that and begin to kind of loosely draft slash sketch a kind of notion of what those unfolded forms might be like. Here we have one of the walls is going to be lower, so I'm tapering the roof up, discovering that my measurements were off there a little bit. That's okay, this is just a sketch. One snap of the finger and there it is on the paper, already traced. And I will cut this out. I'm going to add the roof form off to the right over here, connected to that wall so that I can fold that up. And then I'll cut this shape out and show you a technique for folding the roof form. Cut the taper of the roof there. Also start to work through folding this together now, thinking I might use tape because I didn't leave myself tabs, which would have been smart. But we're going to kind of just make this as a quick study model of one kind of little unit that we could think of. So there's the folding coming together. I'm using my straight edge as an edge to fold against, and looking at maybe this becomes a kind of balcony in the front, this one flap of the what was the form, and using some tape to kind of quickly piece together this model and what it might look like if it had a ground underneath it. And so there are a few things to consider when considering the portion of which part of the design you're going to make your model out of, and also concepts that you're developing as you're developing them. The first being that we are focusing on human-centered design, which feeds into the second point, biophilic relationships. The third point being that we're going to look closely at the elements we're working with. That could be a roof, a wall, or even the floor or stair. For example, the kind of commonly referred to as elements of architecture, the kind of tools we deploy in space to create buildings. The fourth being that quality and craftsmanship are of the utmost importance. We really want to focus on the attention to detail and bringing the elements together in the design and in the architecture, which might also mean focusing on enclosure. How is the actual space enveloped and enclosed? In this kind of loose sketch here, I'm not really showing an enclosure. So how does that space become an interior space? Six being that the uh, design is multiple at this point, meaning you're going to have more than one kind of direction for where your design goes, and that's totally fine. It's totally normal at this point, and it's something we want to see is multiple iterations and kind of evolutions of your design concept as it moves forward. So thank you for listening.